And if you register in our system a day or two after the program, I will send an email to registrants, and you'll also get the PDF of the slides from our presenter tonight. So housekeeping for folks in the room. If we aren't talking into a mic, the folks in the Zoom can't hear. So if you have a question, maybe raise your hand and we'll bring you the mic and you can ask it into the microphone and then they'll hear it. If you have never been here, raise your hand if you've never been here before. Wow, I always love to see that. Welcome. There are bathrooms out in the foyer there. So bathrooms and water if you need to take a break. So please turn off your cell phones if you have them. Step out if you are going to take a call during the program. And with that, I want to turn to introducing Stan Dean, who is one of my favorite land stewards. He's been here. He started, I said one of my favorites. And he's been involved with the program for longer than I have been involved with the program. And he is a retired civil engineer. But when I first met Stan, he said, I'm working on my second unpaid retirement. And that is really true. He used to do so much with our program, and now he still helps us out, but he does other things with Jackson Soil and Water Conservation Service. And he'll probably mention a couple of those things. I don't have your bio right on my hand, but he, yes. But he's very knowledgeable and a tremendous resource for our program, really helps us with questions about all kinds of water systems issues. He co-authored authored our water systems document that we use for the Rural Resource Guidelines. So he's a really wonderful resource to have for the program. And with that, I will turn it over to you. So just turn your mic on green if you haven't, and we'll check and make sure that the Zoom folks can hear when you start talking.
Okay, can Zoom folks hear?
Yes.
Okay, good to go. So, Marcy, I assume that if there's any stuff in chat that I need to know about, you'll check that on and
Yes.
interrupt and let me know?
Yes, or Rachel, one of us will.
Okay, one of you can.
Somebody asked if they'd like to see the speaker.
Yeah, can they see?
I can move over to the other side, but then I'm going to block the screen, I think.
Yeah, I can try to zoom in a little bit. I'll let them know I'll try to work on that.
Okay. Let's see. Okay.
You can just do what you're going to do. And
Maybe if I move this back, I think it might help. Okay. I'm going to admit that getting comfortable today is one of my challenges. I had both of my knees replaced in late March. And so I'm doing well on my recovery, but that's kind of why I need to sit up and I need to stand up. I can't stay in one place too long. I got to move a little bit to keep things loosened up. So anyway, I like to keep my presentations fairly informal. So if there are questions along the way, I like to take them as we go. Unless we find ourselves slipping too far behind on schedule, then I'll try to move things along. And I can speed up or slow down to try to adjust time and how people are feeling here. I don't know whether we'll want to take a break or just go straight on through. I'm guessing if we go straight on through, about an hour for the presentation, half hour for questions mixed in, and we're probably about an hour and a half is probably what we'll need here. I find that much more than an hour and a half, and people get antsy to go home and have dinner. But we'll do what we need to do to get through it. Okay. Okay, Rachel gave a very nice introduction. Thank you, Rachel. But a little bit more about myself. My civil engineer, my whole career in civil wasn't building bridges or roads. It was all water stuff. And then I did retire fairly early and moved to Oregon. And I do treat it like a second career. It just doesn't come with a paycheck on it. Because I've really gotten involved in land stewardship and natural resources conservation. So it's a slight shift, but I really try to keep focused on the water aspect of both of those in a lot of the stuff I do. So I did spend many years with this land steward program. I've kind of backed out on it because some of my other obligations have really taken off. Jackson Soil and Water, I chair the board of that. And then I sit on a couple of statewide conservation committees too. And that's really sucked a lot of my time, and I have to maintain a work-life balance, and I think I'm doing it most of the time. So in terms of water, I tend to think that I know a lot. I know a little about a lot in water. But when we go into ponds today, I'm sure you're going to ask questions that are going to stump me and that I don't know about, and that's just fine. I can't know everything about everything. So I welcome you to challenge with questions. If I don't know, I'm going to say I don't know, or send me an email and I'll get back to you with your answer, because I can find it out. Okay, here today, how many people? Zoom can't really chime in on this, but I'm just going to ask the people in the audience. How many people here have ponds? Oh, quite a few. How many people don't have ponds but want ponds? Okay. How many people are going to give me the most challenging questions in the room? Okay, I got eyes on you guys. Go for it.
This is my second time here with you.
Oh, no.
Oh, yes, we came in 2019.
Oh, well then, it's really a regurgitated presentation. I might have added a couple slides and a couple words here, but it's largely the same thing.
Pond was just a hole in the ground then. Now it has water in it.
Yes.
Oh, and what else in it?
Problems.
Ooh, this is going to be fun.
That's why I put my hand up on the challenging questions.
Okay. So what we're going to talk today, we're going to spend some time on the physical features of the ponds. You know, what are the inlets and outlets and all of that. I'm going to talk about regulations because they are important and you should know them. A little bit on biology and chemistry and what happens in the water with everything that's growing here. I think that's often one of the biggest problems with ponds, other than the squirrel dug a hole through the dike. But the squirrel goes into problems and possible solutions. We'll talk about that a little bit later. I wish I could get rid of those squirrels. One of the first things to think about is if you have a pond, really is the purpose of the pond? What do you use it for? What do you like about it? Why do you need it? Because there are many different configurations of ponds, and depending upon your uses, you're going to need to design and manage them very differently. So I want you to think about it. Stock watering, are you using it for your cows or sheep? Irrigation, are you going to pump out of it and use it for growing things during the course of the year? Recreation, do you want to swim in it? That's a tough one around here. Tough one to get it swimming quality unless you're really brave. Wildlife, whole different design for that. Aesthetics, you just want to look out your window and say, oh, I love just looking at the water. It just comforts me. Okay, great. Fish production. Do you want catfish in there that you can pull several dozen catfish out of there every year and throw them on the dinner plate for guests? And fire protection. And again, each one of those is met with different design, with different considerations. For example, if wildlife is your biggest concern, you may not really need a deep pond, and you may not care that there's a lot of weeds in it because the wildlife is just fine with that. If you want to swim in it, now you really need to think about getting a deep pond, not drawing the water level down so you get these muddy banks on the side. So that limits your use during the summer, and you have to have enough water to keep it full. And you better darn well think about how you're going to manage the algae and the growth in that pond if that's what you're after. So again, every different purpose has different design considerations to your pond. Okay, a couple different ways you can build them. One of them, you can just go and dig a big hole in the ground, excavate a big hole, and that can work. Another, which we see most often historically, is a dam across a channel because, of course, people want the natural stream flow to fill their pond. If you just dig a hole and you're not in an aquifer that's bubbling up and filling your pond, then you got to think about where's the water coming from. If you dig across a channel, well, you've got water, maybe, depending upon whether your watershed is big enough and to have that much water. And once you put a dam across the channel, your whole regulatory structure changes dramatically to do that. And you got a lot more hoops to jump through before you're going to be able to do that. Various side slopes going down, various depths, various shapes, anything you can imagine you can do. And liners, we'll talk a little bit liners in a little bit here, and various amenities. We talked about, I said, if your purpose is fire protection, well, how are you going to get the water out of the pond? Other than a helicopter coming in with a scooper and scooping the water up and digging it out. Well, do you need a pipe and a pump station? Is that pipe daylight above the water? Is it below the dam? Do you need an extra pump with it? So with each of these purposes, again, think about the amenities you need. If you want to go get your boat out, where are you going to put your boat in? Okay. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about construction of a dam. And you really should not just get a big bulldozer and push a bunch of earth around and put up a big berm and expect that to hold over time. There's really a lot more to design of the retaining structures that hold the water back than that. One of the first things is a cutoff trench. And I'll show a picture of this in one of the next slides here, what a cutoff trench is. But basically, if you have existing ground, you just don't want to start piling up on the existing ground. Actually, what you want to do is you cut a channel into the existing ground, and you're going to put really strong engineered material in that cutoff trench. So that's going to anchor the bottom of that dam to the existing ground. And then you're going to build a core, which is also really strong material, up from that. And then on the outside, you can place the remaining fill material in it. So again, you just don't go out there and say, push up a bunch of dirt. Yeah, that's not the way to do it right. Okay. So I talk again, the core needs to be very strong, impermeable material. And when you think about it, you really don't want any way for even very small channels of water to start seeping through the core, because over time, those will grow. First, a little clay will come out with it, then a little more clay, then a little bit of silt, and all of a sudden you got a hole, and those things are not fun to fix. You almost have to, in some cases, you might have to rebuild your dam if it gets too bad that way. And so you just also don't go and scrape up a bunch of soil from around your property and say this is going to be good enough and run your cat over it a bunch of times to compact it down. You really need to understand the gradient of your soils. You need to have some clays in there because it'll really block the pores, but you don't want all clay. You want some clays, you want some fines, you want some big stuff. And all of that stuff can pack and make a really impermeable layer if it's all in the right proportions to each other. And so really, if you're going to build a dam that is going to hold a bunch of water behind it, you really should go out and speak to a soils engineer or a geotechnical engineer and look at the soil where you're taking it from and analyze, is this good soil? Does it meet these specifications? If not, am I going to get some other soil that I'm going to blend into it and mix it all together to get that right mix before you place any of it down? And you don't want organics in your soil. You don't want roots and organic material because that will decay and that will start those first little places where seeps can occur. Okay, a couple things to think about. an inlet. Where does the water come into the pond? Well, it's pretty simple. If you are on a stream, you know where the stream comes into the pond. If you've dug a hole, well, you might be piping it in there. So that's pretty obvious. Outlet where it leaves the pond. But the outlet design is pretty darn important because you want to be careful about not just putting a berm and saying, I'm going to let it run over and spill over it because that'll erode the back side of it. So an outlet really, in my mind, should be a piped type of structure that is solid, and the water can go into that pipe, either into the sides or over on the top, and then a pipe runs through the dam on the thing and outlets down below, and there needs to be some valve structure on that so you can turn it on or off. So you can also drain the valve. So you need to be able to drain your pond, because if you are going to if you have to rehab it, put in a liner, or you have to do something to the dam because you've got holes in it, you want to be able to get the water out so you can repair it when you need it. Spillway. So you've got some sort of structure to let the normal flows out, but how do you let the really big storms out of it? Those are going to overwhelm most outlet pipes. So you need to think about, when the big storm comes, how am I going to channel it around the dam, not straight over the dam, but around the dam, and then down a hardened path with riprap or concrete or something else that's not going to erode away and ruin your dam in the big storms. So that spillway is really important to think about, particularly if you're on channel with your dam. Okay, am I getting any questions so far? Okay, we'll keep going. Here's a couple of photos of what I've been talking about. Let's see. There we go. So this is a view looking down. Here's the water back behind here. This is all the dam. Here's a conduit that goes through the dam and the outlet. And here's the spillway that goes around it for those really big flows. Looking at the same thing in cross section, here's that cutoff trench that I talked about earlier, dug into the native soil. Here's the pipe that goes through it. Here's the core, the really strong stuff that goes all the way to the top. And this area in here is the rest of the fill that completes the dam. One thing I don't like, a couple things I don't like about this is this diagram doesn't show any valves on this. It should. You got to have a valve. I also wouldn't put this inlet smack on the bottom of the pond, because you're going to get a bunch of trash and muck that's going to go down there and clog that thing up. So I like to have a riser for the outlet. The other thing it doesn't show is right along this conduit here is where seepage can form very easily, because the conduits are smooth. So the water's naturally going to want to go right on that edge. So you should have cutoff collars around this conduit that block that seepage and force the water to go in alternate paths if it's going to percolate through the dam. And I'll show those in the next one. Interesting, I have some criticisms on this, and I got this from Oregon Water Resources Dam Safety Booklet. It was published in 2001. I would have thought they would have shown some of those other features on there. So I just went online and I actually found one all the way from a Virginia Cooperative Extension Service that showed what I wanted. I'm sure there's a lot more out there. But in this case, here is a riser that goes on that drain pipe. And so the water then flows. Actually, this is really nice because it's kind of got like a capped top on it. And the water flows underneath it, up over, and then out. Really nice way to keep debris out of that.
The top.
Yep. Yeah.
How do you
That's, yeah, those glory holes on those big dams, that's what they're doing. Now, most of those big dams, they will also have intermediate ports at different levels going down where they can take water off of different levels in there because they want different water quality in the streams that go down. But that's a whole new different design than just basically your farm pond. So here are these concrete collars that I wanted shown. I also like that they've shown riprap, basically rock or something else that hardens the slope of that above the water level. So the water level comes up and down, the splashing doesn't erode the sides. Okay, pond liners. A couple ways you can make the water from percolating down. One is if you have just the right soils, or you mix your soils just right with the different gradations in there, you can compact them and they'll be pretty darn impermeable if you get the soil mixture right and you compact it right. You can also bring in clay, specialty clays. Bentonite is the one most people talk about. I think you actually have, bentonite is mined in other Western states. I don't even think you mine it here in Oregon. It's pretty hard to find.
Yeah, we got 15 tons from Western Oregon. We actually grow it ourselves.
There's a mine there.
There is.
Yes.
Wow.
They are very user friendly.
Okay.
It's very inexpensive. We shopped all
Super
around.
inexpensive.
It was $100 a ton. Sorry.
There's a mine in about 2 hours west of Bend,
Okay.
and they charge about $100 a ton. But you have to go get it yourself or hire somebody to go get it.
Okay.
Comes
And
in big bags.
yeah, each bag weighs about 2,500 pounds.
Okay.
But so Oregon has a source for.
I was not aware of that. Like I said, I don't know everything about ponds. Yes.
Stan, we already have a pond, but so maybe you'll address what happens when you're not doing pond de novo. But how do you know whether you're going to have the soil that's right for it or not? I mean, is there some geo survey you can do in advance?
Well,
How do you even know it's an option is what I'm trying to say.
frankly, I would speak to a geotechnical engineer who will do an analysis of the different particle sizes and types of particles in the soil and see whether you have the right mix. And then they can actually then mix that up, compact it, do infiltration tests on it to verify whether you got the right mix on it. So bentonite, there are a couple of ways you can use bentonite. One of them, which I think is the most common, is you take your native soil and you mix that in so that there's a certain proportion of the bentonite to the clay. Then you compact that on your pond. And then you really should put another layer of soil on top of that to hold the bentonite in place, because it's really soluble in water and it will tend to get murky and dissolve in the water unless you keep it somewhat separated. Is that what you did?
Yeah, we compacted it.
One thought though, it's actually it's 2 hours east of Bend. I said originally west.
Okay.
Backwards, it's about 2 hours east of Bend. But yes, we have clay soils, fortunately, that were laid. We had our contractor put about 18 inches of clay soil down in the bottom, and then we spread the bentonite on that and then compacted it in.
Okay. So you didn't mix the bentonite with the clay before you did it. You just
Correct.
put it, and that is the second way you can do it. You can add a layer of pure bentonite and then put some additional soils on top of that to hold that in place. That's the second way.
I think that mixing is the better way to do it, but we just didn't have that capability with that size.
Okay.
Pond.
Okay. You can use concrete or shotcrete, which is sprayed concrete. I don't like that because if it cracks, then you just got a crack that the water can flow through. And you can use plastic liners. A lot of people do it. I highly recommend if you're going to do a plastic liner, you get a professional to install it.
We have a pond, but it's got a stone bottom.
Okay,
Oh, all right. So we have a pond, but it's got a stone bottom.
okay.
Would the bentonite be able to seal that, or would that leak much?
Maybe
solid
not,
rock.
it might leak some, but I would want to make sure the stone is well graded so that it's thoroughly covering
So
everything.
it's a solid rock. Like it's pure rock. There's
Oh,
it's like, imagine a large chunk of granite
oh,
that completely covers the bottom of the pond.
It might have cracks in it, that's the problem.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
I'd say that's the problem.
yeah,
Would that bentonite go into those cracks and fill them?
maybe, maybe not, depending on how you got it applied and whether you could get it down there and whether you got some part way down there or whether wave action washes it out or it's hard to tell.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so every liner has problems, depending on,
There's a question in the chat.
okay,
Let's see here, a couple. One is, can you top it with decomposed granite after you blend and compact and then add DG, then compact again?
possibly. The DG I worry a little bit about because it is fairly permeable and I wonder how tight that would be in holding the bentonite down. I would want to use something that's a little more a range of gradations in it.
And then one more question here, and then Henry, any precautions or concerns with the use of bentonite if you have fish in ponds and a lot of wildlife, deer, ducks, geese, eagles, osprey that visit the pond?
I don't have any knowledge of bentonite being a environmental hazard in any way. But if you have fluctuating water levels in your pond and it dries out, it can crack. And then when the water comes back up, it can resuspend. So if you don't have that bentonite properly covered or sealed into your layer, it can create some murkiness in there.
Just to let you know what bentonite is used in the pharmaceutical industry, you're eating bentonite in pills and in liquids and so on. It's used
Oh,
as a filler in consumption, human
Okay.
consumption. So it's
Okay.
not toxic.
Two other quick questions. One is, if there's a spring underneath there,
okay.
if you use bentonite, do you have a problem of it bubbling up underneath, pushing it up?
Depends on how much force there is pushing up and how much you've got coming down. But if if the hydraulic head is pushing it up through there, I would worry about that.
Then the second thing is ducks. How well does duck poop work?
How will what?
Duck poop, like sealing the pond because of the ducks. I've seen
They actually mix
the-
duck dung.
duck
And
done
then
in
they-
Australia because ducks tend to have it in Texas too. Yeah.
My experience is I haven't worked with duck dung, but I have done, municipal wastewater lagoons, which are much thicker and have much more stuff in them. And those will become self-sealing as those particles compact on the bottom of the pond. So that would be the closest analogy I've had experience with.
There's another comment in the Zoom. I'm a hydrologist. We use bentonite in all kinds of environmental applications to protect drinking water resources from contaminations. On Zoom can't hear all the in-house questions, and we apologize for that. It's difficult. We just have a microphone that we can pass around, so it's a challenge. Thanks for your patience.
Okay. Okay, some other things to think about if you're with your pond: adequate water supply. Okay. Yeah, this is fine.
Okay. One more question from the Zoom. What would you recommend for the final top layer that is not permeable after blending bentonite that won't make your pond muddy or murky looking? We are on rich clay soils already as well.
I would talk to a soil scientist or geotechnical engineer and make sure that top layer has some fines, some clays, some silts, and probably some larger particles in there for structural stability. You need well-graded mixture of stuff to really hold it in place. Okay, adequate water supply. You build a pond. Do you have enough water to fill it? Is the water that you're going to fill it with, is it good quality? Do you want that water in there? Weed control. If you're going to try to mechanically remove weeds in one fashion or another, how are you going to do it? If fish are planned, and I'm going to talk about each of these a little bit more as we go through. If fish are planned, are the conditions in the pond suited to the type of fish that you want to raise? Aeration equipment. A lot of people put aerators in ponds. I kind of have mixed feelings on that. We'll talk a little bit about that. Livestock. Well, I'll show you a good idea for livestock. Mud control, bank stabilization. If you're going to swim, where are you going to get access to it? Sometimes you'd like to go swimming in your pond, but you got weeds around all of the bank, big, tall cattails and things like that. Well, do you want to get in there? Access for fire trucks. So if it's going to be fire protection, how are you going to get the water out? How are fire trucks going to back up to it, put their suction pipe in there and not suck up a bunch of muck and ruin their equipment? Okay, the question of enough water for your pond. You can, and it's not easy to do, but you can look at get some topographic maps, estimate the whole size of your watershed, look at the types of soils, how much is percolating down, look at rainfall intensity charts, how much rainfall you get during the year. Do you have impermeable surfaces? All of those different factors come into play with how much water you get off of a watershed. And you can run some calculations and figure out how much water you're going to get on an annual basis in a normal or extreme up or down years. Some people that I've seen have just have ponds that hold nothing but rainwater catchment systems that come off of their roof, and you put it into a pond. And that's pretty darn easy to estimate the amount of water you get from that. But you better do your estimates. You better build a pond and make sure you got enough water to fill the darn thing. I helped one guy who was put in a rainwater catchment pond, and a friend of mine asked me to say, do I have enough water? And I actually set up a little model that would, it would look at, okay, the first year, you're going to get much rain here. If you use this much water, it's going to come down. Second year here, third year here, based on his use and everything, to try to figure out, does he have enough water? That's what I mean by really think about year to year, how much is in, how much is out, and what does the water level look like as you go through the summer and into the fall, and is that okay with you? Pond losses can be substantial. Evaporation can be a huge loss. You're gonna lose not a couple of inches, you're gonna lose several feet over the course of the summer just to evaporation. So you have to account for that. So if you have a really deep pond, a small surface, that may not be so much, but if you have a shallow, big pond, a couple feet of it may deplete almost everything in there, just from evaporation without using any of it. Okay, this is an idea I really like. So here's the outlet from the pond, and this guy wants to feed some cattle. So instead of letting the cattle just walk up to the side and create muddy banks on everything, this person fenced the pond away and then put a valve right here so that he could just fill a little trough outside of the pond and keep the cattle out, but it could still use it for stock watering. I think that's a really nice idea. Okay, we're going to move into regulators. The main regulator for ponds and dams is the Oregon Water Resources Department. That's the state organization. And the local water masters around the state they are employed by, they are members of OWRD. They're just local representatives. So we think in Jackson and Josephine, we have our water master. Some people call them the county water master. They're not actually county employees. They're employees of Water Resources Department. So they're gonna, if you need a water right, they're gonna be responsible for that. If you need to build a dam, you're gonna have to get their approval to build the dam. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that approval would involve. Others could be involved. Oregon Department of State Lands, Army Corps of Engineers. So if you have any fill or removal of soil within a channel of so if you have even a intermittent creek that you're damming across, you're building it, that's fill and removal. That's why putting it across a creek is such a headache, because you've got to get those approvals all the way to the Army Corps of Engineers. They're even going to do things like, where's your archaeological survey?
Just get a beaver. Just get a beaver.
Yeah, get a beaver. Department of Environmental Quality, nobody's building treatment lagoons in here for waste. Confined animal lagoons, no, I don't think anybody's doing that, but ODA gets involved in that. And if you're doing any work in riparian corridors, I always have to remind folks that Jackson County does have a riparian ordinance. So any disturbance of the vegetation within so many feet of a stream channel, you got to get a permit for that too. Okay. Classification of ponds. This is going back to Water Resources Department regulations. Statutory or non-statutory, there's a cutoff here. Statutory is the bigger, non-statutory is the smaller. And the cutoff is you're holding 9.2 acre feet of water, or your dam height is 10 feet or more. If you meet either of those criteria, you've got a statutory dam. The question is, what if you have a hole in the ground and it's not a dam? Well, you wouldn't have I don't know. I would ask the water master on that.
That's what they generally call a bulge pond. When I asked the water master that very question, they said you call it a bulge pond and said it's not a problem.
It could, when I read the regulations, it says 9.2 acre feet or 10 feet. And that it doesn't say dug or across a channel in the regulation. So that would be an interpretation of your individual water master on that, not necessarily how the regs are written. So there's also a bulge pond, which was mentioned here a minute ago. A bulge pond is used for irrigation, and it's allowed under our state laws for irrigation. Basically, if you have a water right, you can divert it, or if you're part of an irrigation district, you can put it into a bulge pond and use it and irrigate out of it. But to qualify as a bulge pond, you have to empty it completely when the irrigation system is done. So you just can't call it a bulge pond. You actually have to operate it like a bulge pond too.
Stan?
Yes.
Stan, just to clarify, I think if it's a hole in the ground that is 9.2 acre feet, that is a pond. Doesn't have to have a dam as long as it's holding water. Right? That seemed like what you were saying there. It had to be one or the other of those two things.
No, I'm saying that the regulations, as I remember reading them, don't differentiate a dug in earth versus a dam in terms of statutory or non-statutory. And so I would consult with the water master on that to get their interpretation.
Sorry, one more question related
Yeah.
to that, and you can repeat the question maybe.
Yeah.
Is, if you have two ponds combination of the two, or is it each pond?
The question is, if you have two serial ponds, do you add them together? I would think not. If each of them is designed independently, I think they're independent ponds.
Yeah, even if they're designed together, if you wanted to put in a ton of ponds, you have to fill out a separate application for each one, and each one follows that.
I would, okay, I would think that's true.
Can you repeat that, Sam?
The person in the back piped in and said that if you have multiple ponds, you have to permit each one separately.
Now, but this is a topic that's generating a lot of comments, as we can
Okay.
see. So here's some from the chat. Let's see here. Paul DiMaggio, who is the engineer from Jackson Soil and Water Conservation District, says a hole in the ground may also be classified as a sump and may fall under groundwater regulation.
Okay.
And then another person says, do you need to get approval to dig a small wildlife pond under 10 feet deep and or if under 9.2 feet? So
Okay.
acre feet, which maybe you should clarify that because it's not acres.
Yeah, I'll clarify down here on the slides. I say what an acre foot is. An acre foot is the amount of water that would fill an acre of land to a depth of 1 foot. That's what an acre foot is. And the answer will go into it about permits for smaller ponds. Yes, you need to get a permit for a smaller pond. If it's non-statutory, there's still a permitting process for it. And here we go on that. So water rights. With a pond, it's kind of confusing because you actually have to have, in many cases, 2 different water rights permits. The first one is your primary permit, which allows you to take the water and put it into the pond. Then you have a secondary water right permit, which actually allows you to take it out of the pond and use it. I'm not quite sure what the history of how that was set up in statute, but that's the way it's set up. Once you apply for a water right permit and you get it, there's something called a proving up period, where you must actually demonstrate that you use the water over a period of 5 years. And then you get a certified water rights examiner to come out and they will certify that actually you use it and turn that into the Department of Water Resources. And then you will get your final water rights certificate for it. Yes.
Okay. So what difference does statutory versus non-statutory make if both need to be permitted? Question, and Paul DiMaggio chimes in. Statutory means it must be designed by a professional engineer and must be inspected annually for safety.
Okay, I'll say, Paul, thank you for answering my next slide. Statutory dam requirements. The design must be prepared by a registered engineer and then reviewed and approved by the state. And then there's, as I mentioned before, there's a primary and usually a secondary water right permit application in order to do that, in order to get approval. And there's different processes depending upon where the water is coming from, whether it's surface water or groundwater. There's different forms and paperwork you need to fill out. Once you get your permit, you're obligated to maintain and repair and protect the life and the property. Remember, these things can be dangerous. You got a big dam and it's not built right and it fails. And you got a big wall of water coming down. You can hurt some other people's property down below. And so that's the reason for the engineering of particularly the larger ones. Okay, non-statutory requirements. Actually, it still needs to be designed by an engineer. But the state doesn't really review and approve it. But theoretically, if you're going to do it, you need to have an engineer design it and stamp the plans on it. Non-statutory dam requirements have an alternate permitting process. You still have to fill out a bunch of paperwork, but it's a little more streamlined. The paperwork isn't quite so burdensome on that one. Okay, on bulge ponds, used only for temporary storage of irrigation water. I mentioned that a little bit earlier. You got to drain it at the end of the year, otherwise it's not a bulge pond. If it's a bulge pond and it's of statutory size, it still needs to be designed by an engineer. Permits are typically not required, but if you're going to do this and build a bulge pond, I would definitely go talk to your water master and just make sure they're seeing things the same way you are. There are some exemptions. Stock watering for livestock. You do need a primary water right to take the water in the first place, but you don't need a secondary water right permit to use it, because stock watering is use of stock watering is an exemption under state law, as is rainwater collected from an artificial impervious surface. You don't need a permit to take that water, to use that water. However, again, in either case, if it's over statutory size, you still have to get your engineer to design it and get those plans approved. What about those really small ponds? I got a hard time with this one. The regulations don't distinguish, oh, it's really so small, it doesn't really matter. There's nothing in the regulations that says that. But if you go to your water master, chances are they're going to be reasonable and say, oh, we're not, if you have a koi pond, for example, that's a really small pond. I don't think your water master is going to say, go get a permit for that. As long as it's not filled with surface water and not using a dam that crosses a drainage or some other things that would kick in that permitting requirement. But it's a gray area. The statute actually doesn't say there's something really small that you don't need to permit. Okay, aquatic plants. This is the next phase. In order to grow, there's a bunch of things here that are essential for any plants to grow, and this applies whether they're above the water surface on the ground or whether they're in the water. They obviously need water. They got it if they're in a pond. They need carbon dioxide for photosynthesis, but don't forget, this is in plants, this is a two-way street. Sometimes they're taking up carbon dioxide for photosynthesis, but the other part of that cycle is respiration, where they're actually using oxygen and putting carbon dioxide back out. So there's a cycle that goes on there with plant growth. Sunlight, can't grow without sunlight, can't grow without nutrients. And when I think about nutrients, the ones most people think about are nitrogen and phosphorus, because those are the ones that usually control the rate of growth of aquatic plants. But there's a lot, there's micronutrients and sulfur and all sorts of things that plants need in smaller quantities. Nitrogen and phosphorus is the ones we're really looking at. Temperature. Plants grow dependent upon their temperature. The warmer the temperature, the faster they tend to grow. And they need an ability to reproduce. So in a pond, there are several different types of plants that we have to think about. On the one hand here, there's emergent plants. They typically are like cattails that grow along the shoreline. They're rooted in the ground. They usually stick up above the ground with their surface, but they like that moist environment. Then there's floating plants. You might think like a water hyacinth or a water lily. It's the big leaves that are floating on top of the surface. Duckweed. They're actually a little tiny, but they're floating plants on the top of a pond. We have submerged plants that are rooted in the bottom, but really don't grow much above the top of the surface. And there's algae. They can be really small particles that you don't actually see as plants, but they just cloud the water because they're so small and they're dispersed everywhere. Algae. It's very, very difficult to stop things from growing in ponds. Here's a pond that very small pond. It dries up every year for about 6 months of the year, and you'd think that, oh, that's going to kill off all the algae. Nope. Rains come in November, pond fills up, and look, even in February at 3,500 feet elevation, you got algae growing back in there. Plants are good. They provide good habitat, place to hide for critters that live in the water. They can provide shade. They're a source of food, and we'll talk about the food chain of what happens in ponds in a little bit. Contaminant removal. Plants can uptake contaminants and remove them from the water column. And they can be attractive sometimes. The bad with plants, they can cause wide fluctuations in oxygen and pH. Remember when I talked about photosynthesis and respiration? Well, a lot of that corresponds with day and night. So if you have a pond that has lots of vegetation in it, during the day, you may get supersaturated with oxygen. During the night, when the respiration is the dominant thing going on, all the oxygen can be taken out of the water. Carbon dioxide can be going back in the water. Carbon dioxide suppresses the pH, and all of those things can be harmful to the living organisms in there. So that cycle of oxygen and carbon dioxide and photosynthesis can be a real problem, particularly as you get more and more plants and stuff growing in your pond. They can impede navigation. If you're out canoeing, it's kind of a nuisance to get through them. They can discourage recreation. I don't want to go swimming in that pond. Clog irrigation systems. If you're using a drip irrigation system and trying to pull out of a pond and you want those nozzles to flow clean, real problem. You're going to have to do something to remove them. Yeah, you're going to have to do some really serious filtration. Reduce flow capacity in channels. They can be ugly and some can be toxic.
There is a problem around here, just to warn people, if they have ponds and they have dogs, there's algae that can go in a pond at a certain time of year and it will literally kill your dog.
Okay, so the question or the statement was that there are certain types of algae that can kill dogs and other animals at certain times of years, and those are cyanobacteria, otherwise known as blue-green algae. You'll find those, they're a real problem throughout the state in many of our drinking water reservoirs, and they have at times shut down municipal water supplies because the cyanobacteria become so plentiful. And with climate change, cyanobacteria really like warm temperatures more so than other ones, so that's going to become a bigger and bigger problem through everywhere in Oregon and elsewhere over time. Yes, I'll mention that here in a bit. I'm just going to go through a couple of slides just to show you a couple examples of invasive weeds in here. This is South American waterweed. It made its way into the state through home aquariums that got out of control. We see it widespread in Western Oregon, and basically is break off fragments of it. Those fragments then will go down to the bottom and re-sprout. So you think, oh gosh, I want to remove that stuff. I'm going to go rake all that stuff out of there. Well, what you're doing is you're actually breaking things up and you're allowing all that stuff to settle to the bottom and reroot. Another one that looks similar is Hydrailla. I think this one is, Oregon is more afraid of this one coming into the state. It isn't here right now, but it's in some of the neighboring states. Home aquariums was the culprit. And it can put tubers out along the bottom. So even just removing the mats, it's just going to resprout from the ground. But just like the prior one, it can also, the parts that break off can resprout too. Here's another one that's on the Oregon watch list, invasive species watch list, purple loosestrife. I just showed this one because it's another one that has a different character. It's on the sides of ponds, and it goes above ground. Very difficult with the rhizomatous root masses. So my understanding, it would be like trying to get blackberries out with all of their corms, but in the water. Here's another one that grows, that floats on the top of the surface. Thrives in high nutrients. We find it in various places throughout Western Oregon. Okay, I'm going to go in a little bit of food web. This would be more like your high school biology food web. Everything starts at the bottom with your nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus. Those are uptaken by the phytoplankton. Phytoplankton are just basically those really small plants. And there's a number of forms of phytoplankton in there. But then that is eaten by small fish. It's eaten by zooplankton. You know, remember what a copepod looks like, and small aquatic insects. They'll eat that, and then it moves on up to other fish and bigger fish. Basically a food chain. It's much more complicated than that in reality in ponds, because this kind of implies that everything starts at the bottom and moves up and it's done and it's cleaned up and it's out of there. Wrong. It doesn't get out of there. This is a little more realistic situation of what happens in ponds. And here's a nitrogen cycle. You can get nitrogen coming into your pond from several sources. It can come out of the air, and there's certain bacteria that grab it out of the air and convert it into ammonia and leave it in the water column. You can also have detritus. Detritus is just basically a term for decaying organic matter. So any of that washes into your pond, it washes into your pond and it goes to the bottom, down in the bottom down here. Well, it doesn't just sit there in the bottom of the pond. You got a bunch of microorganisms that are eating that stuff up and constantly decomposing it. Well, when it decomposes, it also comes back to ammonia. And then ammonia then goes into several other forms. It goes into nitrite, nitrate, nitrite and nitrate. And then those are picked up again by the phytoplankton, the zooplankton, the fish. The fish die, they go back down into the bottom. And so the point is that once you get nutrients in a pond, they're just going around and around and around in circles, unless you do something proactively to take the bulk of those nutrients out. And over time, because you've got these sources that are adding, if you don't do anything, it's going to get worse and worse and worse over time. Very similar thing with phosphorus, with the other main nutrient we concern about. You have, phosphorus entering as detritus. It comes in, it is consumed by the phytoplankton, the zooplankton, the fish dies in the bottom, decomposes, go back to phosphorus in the water column. So again, phosphorus just goes around and around in a circle in your pond, getting more each time. So that's one of the reasons you say, don't have a pond near your green lawn, where the runoff from the green lawn can go into the pond, particularly if you apply fertilizer to your green lawn, because the rain's going to come and it's going to wash that phosphorus right into the pond, and it's going to be just keep building up more and more and more over time. So this building up question over here.
Are you going to discuss filtration, pondside filtration for that problem? So like growing plants not in the pond, but next to the pond, and then having the water go from the pond out?
The question was, am I going to discuss taking water out of the pond and using it through a filtration system? And actually that is That is something that can be done. It's challenging, but I think it can be very effective. You can take water out of a pond and circulate it through a controlled wetlands. And that controlled wetlands will do a couple of things. It'll first of all, it'll filter some of the algae out, but there's also biological activity going on in those things. So it'll tend to break down the nutrients and they'll settle into the bottom of those controlled wetlands. And that means they're not in the bottom of the pond. So that is a strategy. It wasn't a slide, but it was a good question.
Do you have links, information, resources? Because that's exactly what I'm trying.
I don't have a really good resource on how to design something like that. I'm sure they're out there, but I don't have one that I've read. In my own experience, I've have some textbooks on how to do it for wastewater treatment, natural systems, but just for regular ponds, I don't have a good resource on that. But if you want to email me and you find something and you want to run it past me, I'm happy to get into an email dialogue with you on that. Okay, so trophic states of ponds. Oligotrophic, that's what everybody would like to go swimming in, except it's too cold. Mesotrophic, okay, we're starting to get a bunch more algae in there. It's getting more nutrients. Eutrophic, it's getting pretty bad, and hypereutrophic is really bad. And so all ponds tend to age. When you go to the top of a mountain, you go up into the wilderness area, you tend not to see as much algae in the ponds. Well, the reason is those are high up and you don't have a lot of junk that is coming down and filling those ponds and building nutrients up. It takes many, many more eons for that to happen than it does down in the bottom of a valley. And there are colder temperatures that keep things from growing up high. So trophic states of ponds, you can get some proxy parameters for how bad is your pond. One of them, you can measure the phosphorus levels or chlorophyll A, which tells you how much plant life you've got in there. Clarity and turbidity, just how clear is the water. One thing that's interesting, if you're really interested in wildlife, wildlife doesn't seem to mind those higher trophic states of ponds. So if that's your objective, maybe that's something you don't worry about too much. Why does oxygen matter? We talked about it, that plants convert CO2 to oxygen. I fell apart, but I'll get it back together.
You're an engineer.
I think I can handle it. But oxygen is really important because it's needed for aquatic animals to survive. And it's needed for decomposition of fungi and some types of bacteria. Some bacteria function with oxygen, some bacteria function without oxygen. But you really need it for the animals that live in the water. As I mentioned before, oxygen can cycle up and down over a period of a day, between night and day. The more eutrophic your pond is, the bigger those swings in oxygen levels will be. Oxygen can combine with phosphorus and form a precipitate, and that precipitate can fall out into the bottom of your pond. It can settle to the bottom. So you'll find some aerator manufacturers saying, hey, put this in here, it'll precipitate the phosphorus and it'll make your pond cleaner, less eutrophic. That may work in some circumstances and it may not work in other circumstances. So I really get concerned about that claim because phosphorus may not be the limiting nutrient on what's controlling the growth in there in the first place, of which it won't make a difference. Also, if you precipitate the phosphorus out and it goes into the bottom, remember those cycles I talked about earlier? Well, eventually back, it'll come back in the cycle and it'll get resuspended back up into the pond just at a different time. So it really doesn't take care of the problem long term, in my mind. It's not necessarily a good solution for controlling algae growth. Oxygen does one thing that's really good. If you have a mucky bottom on your pond, you may not have oxygen down there. And without oxygen, the bacteria that work without oxygen create hydrogen sulfide, that rotten egg smelling gas. Well, oxygen in your pond, as that gas bubbles up, oxygen will neutralize that and convert it to something else. So if you got a smelly pond, aeration can be pretty important for taking care of it. And I think that's the main reason I'd want to put oxygen in there. Keep in mind that colder water can hold more oxygen. You might, depending on the normal range of temperatures in your water, you might be able to hold 10 parts per million of oxygen in your water if it's really cold. But if your water gets up 70, 80 degrees, it may hold just a fraction of that amount of oxygen in the water. So if your water gets high, if your water gets warm, your oxygen is going to go down. Yeah.
Are you kind of going to get to the question about how to control algae, or how maybe to?
Yeah, we're gonna get there a little bit. We're gonna have some slides of how people have done it, which I think are kind of amusing. So oxygen, there are several different ways you can do it. Some people have these spray aerators that spray it in their pond. Some mix the surface. You can create waterfall features. If water falls down, it mixes oxygen in there. So there are a number of ways you can do it. I think I mentioned this, that warmer temperatures, plants grow faster. So not only do you have less oxygen, your plants are growing faster. Bacteria are using it faster. And as I mentioned also, just the temperature of the water means there's less in there. So if you get warm water, that's why you get stagnation and odors in the summertime much more than you do in the wintertime for all of those reasons. Okay. Let's see. Okay, light. Very important in controlling the character of the growth in your pond. So if you have a dense canopy of trees over the pond, how do you think that'll affect your algae and your plants?
Well, you get more nitrate stuff, you get more stuff in your pond, but you end up with a cooler pond. So
Okay.
the algae's down.
Good answer. So the answer was you get you'll get detritus because you'll get the leaf and the leaf litter that builds up in your pond, but you also won't get as much light there. So you won't get as much growth of the algae. It'll slow the growth and it'll keep the water temperatures cooler. So if you have an abundance of suspended algae, remember I showed you could just have it throughout the water column, these really small particles, and you get murky water. If you have that, what's going to happen? What do you think is going to happen to the other types of plants you will see in your pond? What was your thought?
Well, if it gets, it causes a problem with the oxygen in the water. It just becomes harder for everything to flourish.
So if you have both answers are really good. So one answer was that it just creates more muck in the water that creates all sort of problems. The other one is it shades the bottom, and that is correct. So if you have a bunch of suspended algae in there, you will probably not find a lot of rooted plants that are growing on the bottom of the pond coming up because they're not getting the light that they need to grow. So it'll change the type of algae you get in your pond. So if you have a surface covered with floating water hyacinth all over the top of the pond, what do you think your water is going to look like?
It's like being in a forest. The fish do better. The water will stay cooler. You have less evaporation. But you won't have rooted plants doing really well.
Good answer. So the water will stay cooler because of the shading. You won't have plants growing off of the bottom as much because they're not getting the light. And you probably won't have as much suspended algae in the water column either because they're not getting the light either. So underwater hyacinth, you'll probably find pretty clear water in most cases. Clear water with direct sun, everything can grow. Okay, flow. Flow matters. Over on the right-hand side here, I show up just a pond. Let's just say it had 1 million gallons of water in it. 1 million gallons is roughly 3 acre-feet, just to give you an idea of that. So modest size pond. And let's say you've got 10,000 gallons per day flowing in and out of it. 10,000 gallons per day is actually about 7 gallons a minute, which is a little more than a garden hose will put out unless you got a lot of pressure behind your garden hose. So if you have that situation, it would take 100 days for all of the water to be, on average, exchanged in there. Okay, so you're not getting very much flushing out of the water. So many of the different types of algae we've been talking about, and particularly in the summertime, they can double their population in about 2 days. So if it takes you 100 days to flush your pond out, but you're doubling the population every 2 days, are you getting rid of your algae because you're flowing through the pond? No, you're not. You're not at all. And that's why if you look at many of our major lakes and reservoirs in the state, that's why you have more problems with algae in lakes than you do in rivers, because you're not getting enough flow to flush it out. Whereas the rivers, you tend to flush it down a little faster and you have more chance of keeping clean water in there. So flow does really matter. Okay. Mosquitoes. They breed in standing water. When I looked into this, I found that it was kind of interesting in that not all mosquitoes are the same. Some mosquitoes put little larva tubes and get their oxygen on the surface of the water. And some can actually, on certain types of plants, they can put their little tubes into plants and breathe through the plants. So there are different types of mosquitoes. And if you got mosquito problems and how to control, what sort of controls do you want to go? I would go to Jackson County Vector Control District and ask their advice. There are certain types of fish that eat mosquitoes, and you can get some other controls for it. Question?
Well, it's probably worth saying they will give you 25 fish very easily, and they do grow in little tanks and stuff, and I do recommend you do it.
Okay, so
And I overwinter them in water in 50-gallon water barrels, the blue
Yeah.
ones, and then I put them back out, and then they multiply.
can we borrow the microphone of that? I'd like the rest of the audience to hear that one. I don't want to repeat it all. Could you just say what you do?
They're very good about giving you fish. Sometimes they want to come see where you're going to put the fish the first time. I use them in water troughs, and then I overwinter them in a 55-gallon water barrel in my greenhouse, but just next to a house where it doesn't freeze solid. They reproduce, and then you can fish them out and put wherever there are mosquitoes. So
Okay. Thank you for that.
Will they overwinter if the pond doesn't freeze
Yeah.
completely?
Yes.
So you
Yeah.
could
Oh,
leave
yeah.
them in the pond.
Yep.
my
Yeah.
pond
Oh.
currently gets dry, so I kind of.
Thank you.
Weed control, Rachel, for the person online. Several different methods are people have tried over time. One of them is drawdown, drying and freezing. The intent is to kill the plants and the seeds. I don't think that happens very often. I showed you that example of the frog pond out there that dries up for 6 months every year, and that algae comes back no matter what. Now, it might kill some types of plants, but it's not going to be a savior for you. Physical removal. People have tried hand pulling, rakes, drag lines, dredging, mechanical cleaners, just physically getting the weeds out of there. And I will say that if you get them out of there, you will have less biologic material in your pond. And so to some degree, that's going to help with the buildup of organic material, but it can be hugely labor intensive, and it's unrealistic to think that you're going to get all of it. You're just going to buy yourself some time till it builds back up again in there. People have tried shading. Trees are great. People have tried putting plastic covers over their ponds. Okay, that's real great, but if I want to look at the pond for pleasure, I don't want to go pull the cover off of that thing. I used to have a swimming pool, and I wouldn't put the cover on the swimming pool because it was such a nuisance to put that on. I'm not going to put it over a pond, but some people have tried it. Some people have put dyes in ponds. You can actually go out and buy dyes that will, I'll buy a nice green dye that goes out and keeps the light from going down. That doesn't feel too good to me, but some people have tried it. There are other things you can do. Biocontrols and chemical controls. Biocontrols, I'm not aware of any really good solutions in our area. Chemical controls, you can get herbicides that you can put into an aquatic environment that will kill the plants. The problem is you're going to kill them and they're just going to fall to the bottom. And it might look good for a little while, but you just built up the mass of stuff that's going to decay, and the nutrients are going to come back up. You may have bought yourself a little time, but it's going to come back.
I'm sorry, I put arborist wood chips around the pond. I put arborist wood chips all the way around the pond, which made it easier to weed. And the water looks much clearer this year. Do you know any mechanism by which that would happen, or is it just I have clear water this year?
You might have clear water, just have clear water this year. I don't know why the wood chips would work, but there is another method that I didn't put in here. And there are you can get bales of, I believe, rye. And some people put rye into their pond, and it's
barley straw.
Oh, barley straw, that was it. Thank you. If you have a barley straw, that'll clear it up because it excretes some chemicals that will that inhibit the growth of algae. I haven't tried it, but it's in the literature, and I think it can work.
It works great.
Okay.
Just throw the straw into the water?
Yeah. Throw a bale in.
You could take fish net, put it around the bale if you want to. I mean, bale's $6, $7, $8. You can buy the really expensive pellets and so on online, but we have barley straw available around here, and you can split the bale open. I put it in laundry bags, my koi pond, and hung them in my koi pond, and they'll last 4 to 6 months. Then you got to pull the barley because you don't want to add it to the bottom of your pond. So don't just open a bale and throw it in your pond.
That works
You
too,
know.
actually, because that's what I do.
I know, but then you don't. Then you're adding detritus to your pond, and you're adding more organic matter to your pond, and you're creating a problem again.
Yeah, very good input. Thank you.
I want to point out that there's somebody that sells.
I have these gigantic, I have these huge 800-pound bales of
Around
straw. No, the squares, the huge square ones that I use to, I'm a farmer, so that's what I use as my, my mulch. And the pond level came up this year much higher than it's ever been before. And it ended up with half the bale inside the water.
Wow. Neat story. We have another question. We have another question over here.
Barley straw, like about half mile down the road on this very same road. It's right there. There's a sign right on this road going into Jacksonville, barley straw. So it's just a half mile down on your right or left.
Okay, we have a question over here.
What about controlling willow trees?
Controlling willow trees was the question. I don't know why would you, is it just so thick you can't get through them or you can't see visually? That's going to be pretty tough because they spread through the bottom. I would hope that at some point, if you had a deep enough pond, they wouldn't expand out into the middle. But I think you'd have to, if you really wanted to get rid of them, I think you'd have to drain your pond and basically dig up those ones that you don't want. I think that'd be my guess of how you get rid of them. Okay. Going back to weed removal, here's just a couple of photos that I find rather amusing of how people have tried it. Here's a rake. Here's a cutter head. And basically the person who uses the cutter head stands on a boat dock, throws the thing out and pulls it back and it slices off the weeds. Okay, you might be able to row your boat out a little bit more, but you're putting all that stuff in the bottom and you're not really getting it out of the pond. Here's a circular drag line. Boy, this is getting pretty fancy here with this whole fork thing that goes out and you put it in the water and you pull all your stuff out. Here's another one pulling muck out of a pond. That's a lot of work. Okay, going back to algae, I think we've talked about it. Green, blue, green, which is cyanobacteria. The cyanobacteria are the ones that create that are bad. But diatoms, and there's more different types of algae than the phytoplankton, or the different types of algae. They can be dispersed, small little particles in the water column, as we talked about. They can be filamentous, clump forming, all different forms. And I mentioned here blue-green, they're the ones that release the toxins. All of those will die eventually at certain times, particularly certain times of the year. And when those die, as they start to decay, that decay process often sucks up a lot of oxygen out of your water. So not only it's the cycling of the oxygen with the living plants, but the ones that are decomposing also suck it out of there too. If you suck too much oxygen out of your water, your fish will die. It's as simple as that. Let's see. Yeah, Henry.
Is there a good test for the cyanobacteria?
I would check with one of the local labs, and I think it might be pretty hard. I think there's probably only a few labs around the state who do it.
What would be a sign that you have? You would never be able to see it, or is there like something you see?
I would be hard pressed to give you a way to identify it, but I'm sure if you go online and look up how to identify it, and then search around for labs that can actually test for it, or the toxins that come out of it, if you really want to know. Okay. Okay, algae control. We talked about some of this stuff. Keep out the nutrients, like the lawn. If you have animals, and you have animal manure, don't let any of that stuff run into your pond. It'll make it more eutrophic quicker. You know, remove the algae. Some of those methods, if you really want to, you can pump and filter it. Put in a pump, and you can get mechanical filters. Mechanical filters can be expensive. They can require a lot of maintenance, a lot of cleaning. But if you really want to try it, go ahead. Copper sulfate is an algicide you can add in. There's also another chemical here that forms hydrogen peroxide that acts as an algicide. You can get manufactured bacteria and enzymes. People will claim that they'll remove algae. I worry about some of the claims from some of these manufacturers. Yes, they might lead to short-term solutions, but again, if they kill stuff and it goes to the bottom, it's going to come back. And if you get into buying a product that's going to do it, you're kind of hooked into buying it forever, if that's what you want to do. So I get a little bit leery about recommending people to get hooked on one of these manufacturers' claims. Put this in your pond and it'll clean it up. Going back to fish, depending on the type of fish you want, really think about your pond configuration. Match the pond to what the fish need. Diversity of habitat is generally beneficial. So if you have a pond that has a monoculture of plants in it, you're probably not going to have a diversity of fish. For example, largemouth bass. Largemouth bass, if you want to have a bass pond where you go catch some nice fish out of it, yeah, you want some plants and some cover so that the small bass can survive and not get eaten by their parents. But the parents, they want to get out of there. They want to go forage in the open area, and that's where they actually grow. So you need to have a diversity of habitats if you want a good bass, pond. Bluegill, not quite so much. They'll live in about anything. But if you want bluegill with your bass, you better have some places where the bluegill can stay protected from the bass, so the bass will eat them all. Trout. Most people really want trout, but you better have cold water. And don't have any other predatory fish in that pond if you want the trout to survive.
Brown trout that will tolerate the temperatures.
Brown will trout.
Yeah, they're growing them in England in controlled situations, but you have to have a lot of oxygen in your water. So it can get warm, but it still has to have oxygen.
That's my understanding too. Of all the different types of trout species, brown are the most tolerant of warm water, but all trout need good solid oxygen levels. Okay, my pond leaks. We're getting actually pretty close here. I know it's 7:30, so I said I'd try to get us out here pretty soon. What should I do? Well, first thing, make sure you don't see water running through your dike visibly, because that could be impending disaster out there. The channel could just get bigger and bigger until the thing collapses. It may not. You may have some rock structures that were in your dike that are not going to get any larger, but that's worrisome if you see water running through your dike. Particularly if you have land below it that could get damaged if the whole thing collapses, or neighbor's land. Sometimes if it leaks, you just need to drain it and rebuild it. Rebuild your liner, rebuild your dike if it's coming through your dike. Now there is some things you can do. If you, say example, you have a big dike, you may not need to take the whole thing out. Some people have taken a backhoe and dug a really deep trench right down the middle of the dike, and then filled that with an impermeable layer, impermeable material that creates a wall in there. So that's one way you can do it without rebuilding the entire structure. What should I have done before I started getting leaks? You should have controlled your varmints from digging holes in there. You don't want a lot of plants growing on your dikes, because trees and you can have short-rooted plants. Grasses are just fine because they'll stabilize the soil, but don't get deep-rooted plants that can put deep roots in there. And then when those plants die, the roots decay, and what you're left with a hole for the water to start coming through. And then make sure all of your flow control features, your spillways and everything are still working. Yes, Rachel.
If from the Zoom, if you do have a dam that needs repairs due to leaks, do you need a permit to perform repairs, and/or should you check with the water master for any reason?
I'm not aware of you needing a permit, but I don't think it's bad to check with your water master in all cases. I think that's just a good practice, but I don't think it's essential. We had a couple other questions here, Henry.
When you put the stones on the riprap, do you put
Yeah.
like a weed map underneath to stop them from sinking in, or there's like some barrier just when for on the dam side, you said to put stones?
You can do it either way. I think it'd be nice if you put a barrier, it'll hold the soil in place a little bit more, but if you get the riprap close, so there's not, wave action isn't hitting it too much, you should be okay with that too. Okay, if you're gonna hire a contractor, make sure a contractor knows what they're doing out there. Just don't go down the neighborhood and say, hey, you got a backhoe and you got a bulldozer, come build my pond for me. I want somebody who's done it before, knows how they're designed. Make sure you get somebody who knows the regulations, knows that, oh yeah, I need a permit for this. Make someone who get your reference checks, ask some questions. How are you going to make sure you've got the right soils? Are you partnering with a soils engineer here to make sure you get the right bend? How are you going to compact the soils? And just all the questions you can find. Really search for a contractor who knows what they're going to do. And that's it. So we want to hang around for more questions or? Yeah.
I have a question.
We just filled our pond last summer
Okay.
with water from the Algae River. During the winter, of course, with all the rain, quite a bit of mud and clay washed into the pond.
Okay.
I thought it would start settling and clearing up, but it's not. It's muddy.
Okay. So what you're saying is in your pond, you've got a lot of suspended materials that are making it muddy. And clay particles will do that. Clay particles won't settle very quickly. So it says you've got a lot of clay in there.
We have aerators running all the time too.
Okay, there you go, because then you're resuspending the clay with your aerators.
I did shut them off for about a month and it didn't do anything though. I was very disappointed after having them off for a month. It was still the same.
I don't know the answer, but it could also be wave action. And bentonite, remember, is super, super fine clay. So if for any reason you have resuspended some bentonite, that could take a very long time to settle.
Okay, that's a possibility. When I mentioned earlier that we did lay it down 15 tons last summer, I forgot to mention that I did take a drag, and once you drag it, it actually mixes with the clay and it goes from the white on top to basically clay colored. So I
Okay.
thought I got most of the bentonite into the clay.
But you may not have, and that could take a very long time to settle out.
So I just have to be patient.
You might have to be.
Does ODFW get involved in any selection of fish that you want to put in your pond?
Good question. I would, if I were going to pick a fish, I would definitely consult with ODFW on that. Trout, they generally don't mind because we're trying to grow that type of species in our native rivers. But remember, anytime you put a fish in there, if you've got a big flow, you can wash that fish out. And there are a lot of predatory fish that we don't want in our rivers. You know, one of the worst ones that could ever get in there would be like a northern pike. People might say, oh, that's fun game fish to catch. But boy, if that ever got in the Rogue River, whew, not good. So I would consult with ODFW before doing that. Definitely. Good question.
There's a question here there are a couple, or at least one in the Zoom. Let's see. Have you heard of the soil cement bentonite slurry method for building impermeable ponds?
That term doesn't get with me, but I can imagine that's basically mixing. I'm imagining that's mixing soil and bentonite and then creating a mixture of the liner. And that would be an appropriate method to do it, if I'm assuming correctly.
My understanding is it's used mostly for channels, so as a farmer, so they literally put it into the water column and it does seal a bit. So
Okay.
it settles down as if you would put a clay suspension, so it's a slurry of bentonite. It's like a very short-term fix though, so it's
Okay.
only good for keeping the water in a little more when you're actively trying to get it back out, but it's not a long-term.
Okay, thank you. Given your description there of that, I would worry about that because I wouldn't want to have the bentonite just sitting there on the bottom without some confining layer to hold it in place. Otherwise, you might resuspend it and it just might be perpetually cloudy. And yeah.
Do you have any suggestions for patching a concrete pond? It's a small one, but it cracks every year.
Suggestions for patching a concrete pond. That's why I wouldn't want a concrete pond. If I were gonna do a concrete pond, I would think about, although I'm not sure I would do this, but in the first place, I might have put a synthetic liner underneath the concrete. Use the synthetic liner to keep the water from leaving, but use the concrete to protect the surface. But I don't know how you're gonna patch a bunch of cracks in there really well.
Some of us inherit concrete ponds, as I did.
Yeah.
And we patched it, we caulked it. We went through and caulked it, and then there's a paint that you can paint on there. It's expensive, but it's now held for 7 years.
Oh, good.
Is that the Flex Seal product?
It's similar to that, but I don't know if it's the stuff you buy at Home Depot. This has to be for fish. It's fish safe. So can of it's gonna run you a bit of money.
Okay. Thank you.
There's another question in the Zoom here. We have a small historic hole in the ground pond that is spring fed and only about 2 feet deep and 40 feet wide. Can we have it dug out deeper without damaging the pond? Our overall soil type is clay.
Maybe, maybe not is the answer to that, because unless you understand what all of the geology surrounding it is, you can't, I couldn't predict whether it's going to be okay or not.
Is there an optimum depth for this? I mean, obviously you don't want to dig so low that you reach, China, but
Yeah.
is there an optimum depth that
I have,
worthwhile? I mean, obviously you have the deeper, the more water you can hold and less evaporation,
yeah,
but what are your thoughts on that?
I have seen a chart that shows minimum recommended depths of ponds depending upon where you live in the country. And so if you're in a really arid environment, you are going to want deeper ponds for the evaporation. But the numbers I saw in this region of the state were like 7 feet. You really ought to have at least 7 feet in there. It was a number I saw. But I think that's a really general recommendation. And like I said earlier, you really ought to think about what's the purpose of your pond and then think about shallower or deeper depending on how you're really going to use it. Okay.
You know what the definitive source for knowing what is and isn't a channel? So
What is a channel?
what is a channel? Is it just runoff from a field? Is that a channel? Like, is there a place you can go to know for sure?
There is a map that is maintained by, I think ODFW keeps it, where there are, where it would be a same map that is used to determine where the riparian ordinance is applicable in the county.
Derek, I'm not sure, but Oregon Explorer is something that's put together by OSU and it has a lot of layers. And I have looked at that, like for stream bearing or not stream bearing, and that might be one of the layers you could explore there.
But I would also caution that if that isn't on the map, if you were going to try to dam another channel and collect the surface water, you would still need a water right permit for that. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, let's if we're all done, let's call it quits, and thank you, everybody.
particular.
Yeah.
I have been living